Greetings everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bite Size History on History with Audrey D. Now in today's lesson we are going to be delving back into ancient China, and I'm going to be continuing that series up into the Shang Dynasty. Now if you enjoy these lessons and you have enjoyed this channel so far, please make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Also find me on Instagram and Facebook, and you can support this channel further through the links in the bio as well as the description below. Now let's go ahead and get into our lesson on the Shang and Zhou dynasties of ancient China. Before Imperial China, before the Great Wall as most people imagine it, and before Confucius became a household name, Northern China was shaped by two early dynasties that helped define Chinese civilization, the Shang and the Zhou. One left behind oracle bones, bronze ritual vessels, and some of the earliest confirmed Chinese writing. The other justified conquest with a new political idea that would echo for more than 2,000 years, the mandate of heaven. But these dynasties are not just the story of kings and battles. They are the story of how power was explained, how religion shaped rule, and how later generations remembered the past. And that last part matters, because some of what people confidently repeat about both dynasties is either oversimplified, debated, or based on later political storytelling. Today we're going to be tracing the arc from the Shang world of divination and bronze to the Zhou world of heaven, political legitimacy, and intellectual transformation. The Shang Dynasty is usually dated to about 1600 to 1046 BCE, though historians are more confident about the later Shang period than the earliest Shang rulers. What makes the Shang so important is that this is the earliest Chinese dynasty confirmed by direct written evidence. Oracle bone inscriptions, especially from the late Shang capital of Anyang, also known as Yinshu. These bones were used in royal divination and recorded questions about war, weather, harvests, illness, childbirth, hunting, and sacrifice. In the Shang world, religion and government were deeply connected. Kings did not just rule politically. They also served as ritual intermediaries, communicating with royal ancestors and powerful spiritual forces. This means Shang government was not simply administrative in the modern sense. It was sacred, ceremonial, and tied to the idea that the ruler could interpret the will of the spirit world. The oracle bones of the Shang are one of the most remarkable source bases in ancient history. Ox scapulae and turtle plastrons were prepared, heated, and cracked, and the resulting patterns were interpreted during divination rituals. The inscriptions written on them give historians an extraordinary look into late Shang concerns and royal life. They also preserve the earliest known fully developed Chinese writing system yet discovered. By the time these inscriptions appear, the writing is already sophisticated, so historians are careful not to say writing was suddenly invented out of nowhere in the Shang court. Instead, the evidence shows that by the late Shang, writing was already functioning at a high level. The Shang are also famous for their bronze casting. Their ritual vessels were not just beautiful objects, they were instruments of religion, status, and political power. Shang bronzes were made with a piece mold casting method that allowed for sharply defined designs, including the famous Tao Ti motif. These vessels were central to ceremonial life and ancestor offerings. One of the best windows into elite Shang life is the tomb of Fu Hao. Discovered intact in 1976 at Anyang, Fu Hao appears in oracle bone inscriptions and was a consort of King Wu Ding. But archaeology shows she was also a major figure in her own right. Her tomb contained weapons, jades, bronze vessels, cowrie shells, sacrificial victims, and evidence of very high ritual status. Fu Hao is especially useful for understanding this dynasty because she complicates simplistic assumptions about women in ancient states. She does not prove gender equality in the Shang, but she does show that elite women could hold major ritual and military importance. The Shang court was deeply invested in ritual sacrifice, and as archaeology has found, that included both human and animal sacrifices. While this fact is real and shouldn't be ignored, it should also not be turned into a sensational horror story history. In the Shang context, sacrifice was embedded in ancestor worship, royal legitimacy, and communication with spiritual powers. It was part of how authority worked. This was a Bronze Age state in which religion, politics, and warfare were fused together. The same evidence that reveals sacrifice also reveals organized rulership, sophisticated craft production, a functioning writing system, and a strong ritual order. Human sacrifice was present, but the Shang were also a complex political and ritual society, with advanced metallurgy, writing, and structured kingship. By the 11th century BCE, the Shang faced a rising Western rival, the Zhou. Eventually, the Zhou defeated the Shang, traditionally in the Battle of Muye, and established a new ruling house. But here, the story becomes tricky, because much of what later generations say about the final Shang king comes from Zhou era, and later sources that had every reason to justify conquest. Later tradition presents the last Shang ruler, often called King Zhou of Shang, or Di Xin, as cruel, decadent, and morally corrupt. These stories became central to the Zhou explanation for why the Shang had to fall. Historians do not simply accept all of that at face value. The key question is not whether Shang rule had problems, as most states do. The key question is how much of the evil last king image was amplified as conquest propaganda. The Zhou Dynasty became one of the longest-lasting dynastic periods in Chinese history. Lasting from about 1046 to 256 BCE, early Zhou rulers inherited and adapted Shang practices, but they also introduced a powerful new framework for political legitimacy, the mandate of heaven. In simple terms, the Zhou argued that heaven had withdrawn its support from the Shang and granted the right to rule to the Zhou instead. This idea was revolutionary because it turned rulership into a moral question. A ruler was not legitimate merely because of ancestry or force. A ruler had to govern well enough to retain heaven's favor. If misrule, disorder, or immorality became severe enough, the mandate could be lost and transferred. That doctrine would shape Chinese political thought for centuries. Remember, however, that the Shang did not necessarily rule under the mandate of heaven. The concept is associated with the Zhou justification for conquering the Shang, even though the Zhou adopted some Shang ritual practices, including divination. During the Western Zhou, the dynasty ruled from the Wei River region in the west. Because the Zhou territory was broader than that of the Shang, early Zhou rulers established regional states under relatives and nobles. Many textbooks call this feudalism, and some museums and educational resources still use that comparison as a shorthand. But that term can be misleading, causing some individuals to imagine medieval Europe mapped neatly onto ancient China. However, instead we should use it to think of China as having a decentralized political order. What matters most is that the Western Zhou created a network of regional power tied to the Zhou royal house. This arrangement helped them manage a large realm, but over time it also strengthened local rulers. And that decentralization would become a major long-term problem for the dynasty. In 771 BCE, the Western Zhou collapsed, and the court moved east, beginning the Eastern Zhou period. From there, the Zhou kings retained symbolic prestige, but real power increasingly shifted to competing regional states. The Eastern Zhou is usually divided into the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. Politically, this was an age of fragmentation and conflict. Intellectually, it was one of the richest periods in Chinese history. As old political arrangements weakened, new ideas flourished. Confucianism, Taoism, and legalist thought all emerged in this broader Zhou era context, especially during the later Eastern Zhou. This is one of history's great patterns. Instability can produce extraordinary creativity. As rulers competed, thinkers competed too, offering different answers to the same question. How do you restore order to a broken world? The Shang and Zhou dynasties are often taught as separate chapters, but they make the most sense when viewed together. The Shang show us an early Chinese state grounded in divination, ancestor worship, ritual bronze culture, and kingship, supported by sacred practice. The Zhou inherited much of that world, then transformed it by reframing political legitimacy through heaven, morality, and dynastic transfer. In other words, the Zhou did not emerge from nowhere. They conquered the Shang, borrowed from the Shang, and then reinterpreted the past in ways that made Zhou rule look both inevitable and morally justified. That combination of continuity and reinvention is one of the core patterns of Chinese history. So when we look at the Shang and Zhou, we're not just looking at two dynasties. We're looking at how Chinese civilization took shape. Writing, ritual, bronze technology, ancestor worship, kingship, regional rule, moralized political authority, and the intellectual conditions that would later produce Confucius and the great philosophical traditions of ancient China. And we should remember one final lesson from both dynasties. History is never just about what happened. It's also about who preserved the story, who benefited from that version, and how archaeology can confirm, complicate, or challenge what later writers wanted people to believe. And that wraps it up for today's lesson on the Shang and Zhou dynasties of ancient China. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and the compare and contrast that we got into a little bit, and also the details that I was trying to convey about how history can be interpreted in multiple ways. If you enjoyed this lesson and this channel, please make sure you hit the like and subscribe button. Again, you can support this channel further through the links in my bio as well as the description below. Thank you for watching, everyone, and I will see you in our next lesson.